Alright, when I'm playing around in the open world, I actually almost never stick to a single build. Depending on the profession, I usually have a build for general gameplay like tagging events, farming rifts and mobs or doing achievements, but also one for when I need that extra bit of survivability in case I want a solo champion or a legendary bounty. Or sometimes I even bring a gathering build. And with this video I want to start a series where I go over these setups for every single profession. Now, since any new character has a couple of build templates unlocked as soon as you make them, and you can also get a couple of extra ones every time the Wizard's Vault refreshes, swapping builds isn't all that annoying to do anymore. But I am very well aware that not everyone might have legendary gear and that acquiring certain stats might be a hassle, especially if you're just starting out. So for that reason, I'll also provide a couple of different gear combinations once we get to the actual builds, so that your first few sets can double for group content before you decide to add some extra convenience for the open world. Now, before we dig into the different skills and trait lines, let's first talk about the engineer, which this video will be all about, as it's often seen as a more daunting one because of its ability to bring kits, but it's also a jack of all trades, which is actually amazing when it comes to the open world, because that means that you'll have a solution for just about anything the game throws at you. And quite often, that solution comes in the form of simply changing out a trait or an ability. And those kits, well, you don't really need to worry about them, because I'm gonna teach you exactly when and how to use them, or how you can even avoid them altogether. Now, despite all three of their elite specs being amazing in literally every single game mode, we're gonna stick to the Scrapper, which I believe is the best all-rounder for any open world content, and bring in the Mechanist for some of the tougher challenges or for when we want a low intensity build. Now, the reason why I believe Scrappers to be the ultimate all-round spec is because they can bring just about anything any other profession can bring, as they can deal incredible burst damage while still generating their own barrier for increased survivability, but they can also bring some more niche things, like stealth to avoid combat altogether, or super speed, which not only makes them run faster, but up to 4 allies around them. And that also includes NPCs, so no more slow escorts whenever you're doing dragon response missions or metas like the Giala Delves. The first build we're gonna go over is one that you can stick to for just about anything and you're always gonna do fine, except maybe for some of the hardest bounties or champions. And since the Scrapper already brings a good amount of innate sustain, we can actually focus on taking offensive trait lines, which in the engineer's case means explosives and firearms. And let's start with the latter, because the traits we're gonna pick here will have an impact on the others. Our minor traits will allow us to inflict bleeding whenever we land a critical hit and also make those bleeds last longer, which is very important despite this being a power build, because we do get an extra 15% critical hit chance against bleeding enemies. But things don't stop here, because thanks to our major traits, we also get Fury every time we land a crit, which will add another 25% critical hit chance for as long as the boon is active. And then we get another 15% for as long as we stay within 450 range of our target. So in other words, this trait line alone is gonna provide us with 55% critical hit chance in and of itself, which is gonna make gearing all that much easier. The final trait we're gonna pick up will increase our damage for every single condition a foe has on them, which won't be limited to bleeding, because the explosives trait line will help us stack vulnerability every time we deal damage with an explosion, which we can do either with our hammer or a rifle, as well as most of our kits and also a couple of our utility skills. Vulnerability is a pretty great condition to be able to inflict ourselves, by the way, as it will let us deal 1% extra damage per stack up to a maximum of 25%. And one of our minor traits will add another 0.5% per stack, so that we get to deal 37.5% more damage, which might not be needed in Corteria, but since the enemies get more and more tanky the later in the expansion cycles, this really starts to add up. Now, since our crit chance is already covered by the firearms trait line, we can ignore short fuse and go for glass cannon instead, so that we can deal 10% extra damage for as long as our HP is above 75%. And then we get to deal another 15% extra thanks to Big Boomer whenever our health percentage is higher than our targets. And that same trait is also gonna heal us roughly every 3 seconds. The middle trait can be whatever you prefer. Blast Shield is great if you're struggling to stay alive, while Explosive Temper will make your crits hit harder. But my favorite is Aim Assisted Rocket, which will fire a rocket every time we cast a missile, as well as an orbital strike after every 4 rockets. And if you're now wondering how we're gonna fire off missiles with a hammer equipped without the ability to weapon swap, I wouldn't blame you. But remember those kits I talked about? Well, quite a few of their abilities classify as missiles. But even a hammer can be used for this, as Electro Whirl is a world finisher, which means that every time we use that ability in a combo field, we're gonna be firing off missiles with our hammer as well. And that brings us to the Scrapper trait line, and our source of a lot of quality of life for this build. We're gonna start by picking up Gyroscopic Acceleration, so that all of our welts now provide super speed instead of only our heal. Then we'll want Object in Motion, so that we can deal 5 to 15% extra strike damage damage for having stability, swiftness or super speed, and kinetic accelerators so that every single blast, whirl and leap finisher will grant us might and quickness. Now you could also choose to replace this last trait with applied force and equip a relic of the Chronomancer so that you can generate your own quickness that way. But once you understand a couple of skill interactions, you won't really need to go that route anymore. So that's our build, and I already talked about hammers and rifles, in which you'll want to equip a sigil of force and impact or air. Now if you'd like to truly optimize, you could instead bring 2 hammers, one with the aforementioned sigils and one with the sigil of bloodlust instead of impact, so that you can build up extra power by killing enemies, which is gonna last until you change maps. As for the gear, I'd highly recommend sticking to the stats recommended on both Meta Battle and Snowcrows for a power DPS or a quickness scrapper, who both use the same gear so that you can take your same character to raids, strikes and fractals, and you only have to change a couple of traits and utilities around, which also makes this a great catch-all solution for both the open world and group content. So start off by getting a set of Berserker's gear, and if you have the option, change your pants, backpiece, amulet and one of your rings to dragon stats with the runes of the Dragon Hunter equipped and a relic of the fireworks. Now if you do have the luxury of getting another set of gear, there are some really cool combos you can go for. In previous guides, I would often recommend Marauder's gear for some extra vitality, which also means having a higher maximum barrier as that scales off your total HP. The problem with this set is that it's gonna overcap your crit chance, but since the addition of Dragon's gear, we could mix and match both sets so that you only get 45% extra critical hit chance and still get a bit of extra ferocity so that you deal more damage while also still improving your vitality. And as of last year, we also have a second option now that ArenaNet introduced Demolisher's gear to PvE as well. As previously, it was often recommended swapping out your trinkets for knight stats so that you have some increased toughness, but that would mean that you lose all of your ferocity and reduce your power. But now that we have this new stat combo, we can actually still increase our toughness, but at a relatively minor cost. And that just about covers the build itself, but we haven't talked about our abilities and how they interact just yet. I've already mentioned Hammer 2 being a world finisher, which you're gonna want to use in Hammer 5's lightning field as often as you can. And this will be your bread and butter attack both for the open world and group content, by the way. As just about any engineer build that uses a hammer will always want to combo these two together and then mix in any of their other abilities. Hammers do offer quite a bit more though, as your auto attacks generate might and inflict vulnerability, and your Hammer 3 is a double leap finisher that will let you evade while casting, which also means that you can cast it in either Hammer 5's or your Function Gyro's lightning field to deal extra breakbar damage, and Hammer 4 is a block that deals damage while generating some extra barrier. As for the utilities, you could literally bring whatever you prefer. I always like having the heal and blast gyros for extra combo fields, might and crowd control, and if you add a shredder gyro to the mix, you get yet another world finisher, which also means even more quickness generation. Lately, I've also been bringing Throw Mind to just about any content I do, as it's yet another blast finisher, but also one that stuns and strips boons, which is something that comes in real handy whenever you're fighting enemies in Soto or the Jante Wilds, as most of them will always apply protection or resolution to themselves. And on top of this, its tool build skill also deals an incredible amount of damage. As for the elite, I usually swap between supply crates whenever I know I'll be fighting in the same spot for some time, and the sneak gyro whenever I do need a bit of extra stealth or super speed. And you can also use that same sneak gyro to blind enemies if you use your world finisher in its combo field. Whenever I need neither, then I default to the mortar kit, so that I still have a long range attack or even more combo fields whenever I need them. But as I said, you can swap any of the utilities according to your own needs. If you want more quickness and stability, then you can grab Elixir U, or if you need a Condi cleanse, then you'll want to bring a Purge Gyro. And if you want more damage, then you can simply bring a Grenade Kit. Now, I know that bringing kits can be daunting if you're new to the engineer, especially since you can't check the ability cooldowns whenever the kit isn't active. But there's actually a couple of tricks that can make this easier and actually translate to group content as well. The most important one is to swap to your grenade kit every time you cast your weapon's second ability, and then you're gonna always want to use grenade 2 and grenade 4 and 5 whenever those are off cooldown. Furthermore, if you don't like aiming your grenades, there's also a couple of settings you can change so that you can cast them by pressing a single button and they will always get thrown towards your current target. That about covers our generalist builds, which should serve you well for just about anything, but it does have a weakness. And that's while it does have decent sustain, it's often not enough for the toughest of challenges. Which is why we're gonna add the mechanist to our lineup so that our mech can do the tanking for us. Our trait lines will stay the same, but we're gonna change some of the traits so that we can play a condition build instead. And since those don't rely as much on critical hits, we're gonna swap high caliber for chemical rounds and no scope for thermal vision so that both our condition damage and duration increases. And instead of the damage boost from modified ammunition, we're gonna go with incendiary power so that we can inflict burning whenever we do land a critical hit and also make burning last longer. All we're gonna swap in the explosive trait line is a Grandmaster trait, as we're gonna want shrapnel so that our explosions also inflict bleeding and have a chance to cripple our enemies. Which brings me to the Mechanist trait line, where we do have two choices. Either we go for support to buff ourselves and the people around us, or we go for a more selfish route and focus on damage. Whichever you end up choosing, the first trait should always be Rolling Smash, as it's the most suited for a condition-based build. As for the other two, I personally prefer a more selfish setup, since we don't really need defensive boons for the mech to stay alive, as we can just glide to reset its HP without the use of any ability or cooldown. And if we ourselves get in trouble, we can just stay at range if needed. So instead of Crisis Zone, I prefer Conductive Alloy, so that our mech inherits more of our traits and can also inflict some extra conditions. And for our final trait, I take J-Drive instead of Barrier Engine, so that we don't lose our Signet's passive effects even when they're on cooldown. As for gear, I'd recommend getting a spear with sigils of Geomancy and Bursting, and if you need to stay at range, to just swap to your grenade kit until it's safe to come back to melee. Alternatively, you could avoid kits altogether by bringing 2 pistols so that you still have a ranged option, but in that case you're gonna need to replace a Geomancy sigil, as it will only proc off weapon swaps, or in our case of kit swaps. Now in terms of stats, there's a bit of a choice that you're gonna want to make if you want a setup that you can also bring to group content, because a Mechanist does need boon duration if it wants to provide alacrity to their allies. So if you'd like to be able to cover the role of an alacrity DPS, you're gonna need Ritualist gear with Trapper runes, which does come with the benefit of having extra vitality. Alternatively, if you want to focus on damage, then you'll want to bring Viper's pieces instead. Whichever one you go for, you'll ideally want to get a Relic of the Fractal, as that one deals the most damage and your mech will do most of the tanking for you anyway. Now, if you don't necessarily want to cover either roles in group content, or you simply want an extra open world set, then this is actually a build that plays particularly nice with Celestial gear, as it will make use of just about every single stat that set provides. As for your utilities, you're gonna want to bring every single signet that can help this build, especially since we're running J-Drive. So that means that you'll want a healed signet, shift signet, which is not only a teleport but also a stun break and a condi cleanse, as well as superconducting signet for the extra condition damage and conditions it inflicts, on top of it being a lightning field, which you can combo with spear 2 for some extra crowd control. And then finally you're gonna want overclock signet so that the cooldown of your other signets will get reduced and you can let your mech fire a mega laser. The last utility depends entirely on you. If you want to stick with my setup, then you're going to want to bring a grenade kit so that you can get the most out of your sigil of Geomancy and also have a ranged option for whenever you need. But if you want to bring dual pistols, then the extra damage from Force Signet or the barrier and projectile reflex from Barrier Signet could be quite nice. Now, if you like the idea of playing a mech, but you don't necessarily want to tackle some of the harder content solo, then you could swap to a power-based build instead and go for a very relaxed playstyle that excels at farming mobs and events, and is even getting some buffs in the next balance patch. To do this, we're gonna want to combine the explosives and firearm traits we picked earlier for our scrapper and change a couple of mech traits around. Since we don't need any condi damage, we can take high impact drivers to help us stack might, and co-reactor shot as well as jade mortar to give our mech 2 powerful attacks, while also providing us with a bit of quickness. In terms of gear, you can actually just copy everything from the scrapper build, but instead of a relic of the fireworks, you're gonna want a relic of the thief. I usually play this build with the rifle whenever I'm doing meta events or farming rifts, but I also do keep a melee weapon in my second set in case I do need to deal with a boss. Now this weapon can be the hammer we used for our scrapper earlier on, which means that one gear set can serve both builds at once, but if you want something that'll be closer to a power mech in group content, then you're gonna want to bring a sword and pistol with sigils of force and air. Both options work equally fine by the way, but it's worth noting that the hammer's block and extra evades can come in handy in the open world, especially when you're solo. As for the utilities, you're gonna want to swap out that superconducting signet for the force one for some extra power and yet another crowd control skill, and since this build uses no sigils that trigger off weapon swapping, you can even pick up throw mine if you want to avoid kits once more. Now, whichever build you go for, they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and I personally swap around based on the content I'm doing. If all I need to do is tag enemies or events that have no risk of failing, I often go for the power mech. But if there's a more difficult meta going on like Eparch, I tend to swap to my scrapper so that I can provide everyone around me with might, quickness, and also have access to a ranged res. And if I want to solo all Heart of Thorns champions, I usually swap to my Condi mech so that I have no risk of dying while still killing them in a relatively short time. Now, if at any point you notice you do need some extra boons, you could always grab the Jadebot protocols, which will provide you with every single boon for about 10 seconds and should help you get through encounters faster. And if you notice any build is lacking in a certain area, you could always try swapping some utilities around or consider a couple of other relics. If you're struggling with surviving on either of the power builds, for example, then the Relic of Zakairos could offer some extra sustain. Or if you like having more boons but you don't want to get the Jadebot protocols, you could equip a Relic of the Cavalier for a mini version of those. Now, if you watch my streams, you already know that there's one more build that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's my Gathering one, as I do believe Scrapper is the very best when it comes to these kinds of farms. The stats on your gear for this one won't matter at all, so you can bring any of the sets I already mentioned, or whatever you have lying around, although some extra concentration could be nice. As for the weapons, you're gonna want to bring either a sword or a mace and a shield. Now, you must understand that this is a non-combat build, because when all you want to do is gather materials, anytime you do get stuck in combat is a bit of a waste of time. So we're gonna focus on completely different trait lines than the ones we talked about before. The first we'll want to pick up is tools, so that we can reduce the cooldown of our tool belt skills, while also letting them cleanse a condition whenever we use them. And grant us Vigor, so that we can dodge more frequently, which in turn is gonna reduce our elite skills cooldown thanks to Power Wrench. And then Gadgeteer is gonna make our rocket boots better by increasing their range and adding some extra super speed. Our second trait line will be Alchemy, which will further improve our elixirs so that they last longer, help us cleanse even more conditions, and sometimes even automatically buff us whenever we use a healing skill or get hit below a certain threshold. Then lastly, we'll stick with the Scrapper trait line so that we get permanent super speed and quickness, but this time we're gonna grab Rapid Generation for even more healing in case we do take a hit, and mostly because neither of the other two traits do anything for us. Contrary to the other builds, I do recommend a fixed set of utilities this time, which are the healing kits so that we get vigor every time we swap to it, and because it's gonna allow us to blast a combo field without getting revealed if we happen to be surrounded by enemies by combining the kit's 5 and 3 abilities. We're rarely gonna need to do this though, and that's because of Elixir U, which even without concentration will provide us with quite a bit of quickness and stability. Next we have the Rocket Boots, which will help us cross terrain faster and are also a blast finisher that can be used in any of our other combo fields for even more quickness. Next we're gonna grab two utilities that will help us completely avoid combat, and those are Elixir S, which will shrink us for a couple of seconds and make us untargetable and should last just long enough to loot any chests without ever getting in combat, and its tool belt skill will also provide us with 6 seconds of stealth, which we can then extend with Sneak Gyro, which is yet another combo field we can use our blast and leap finishers in for even more quickness. Now, if you've done some higher level fractals before, you're already gonna know about this. But this build can actually outpace some of the mounts by using the Choya Piñata tonic, which you can get from the Casino Blitz meta event, or the Executioner's Axe, by combining them with super speed or super speed and quickness in the tonic's case, as both of the dash ability speeds scale off those. So if you need to quickly move from one point to another, you can actually do so without ever needing to mount up. And that's it. These are the 4 engineer builds I frequently swap between in the open world. And with the right gear sets, you can also use these to help you get started on group content, provided you change some traits or utilities around. Now the plan is to make a guide like this for every single profession, so if there's any that you would like to see first, drop a comment down below, or better yet, come ask me on stream, because not only will you get a direct reply, you also get to be part of content such as an all thief raid, endless rift farms, or whatever I can come up with on that day.